Good evening, everyone. I'm Tracy Glab, Executive Director of the FIA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture. Before I get started, a note of sad news. Today we discovered that Bryant B.B. Nolden passed away unexpectedly. He was a board member, the Executive Director of the Burston Fieldhouse, and a Genesee County Commissioner. We're very sad that he has passed away, and so I ask you to please join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. Our thoughts and prayers are with his family at this difficult time. Tonight, we have Dr. Ruggiero with us for a presentation on Leonardo da Vinci, The Last Supper and the Art of Throwing a Great Dinner Party. I love that title. The Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture Series was established in 2012 by Dr. Alan Klein to address the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. Thank you, Dr. Klein, for continuing to bring these wonderful lectures to the FIA. I would like to remind you that the next Sheppy Dog Fun Lecture will be February 15th with Professor Robert O'Mealy, who will present Dancers for the Harlem Renaissance, Josephine Baker, Johnny Hudgens, and Jack Johnson. So that is going to take place on February 15th. Before we bring tonight's guest, Dr. Ruggiero, to the stage, as always, we'd like to take the opportunity to thank the citizens of Genesee County for the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage, which provides free entry to the FIA for Genesee County citizens 7 days a week. Thank you very much. Now, please take a moment to silence your electronic devices. Dr. Ruggiero has been a professor of art and architectural history since 1999. He received his BA from the College of the Holy Cross and a Master of Arts degree from Syracuse University, where he was awarded a prestigious Florence Fellowship in 1996. He furthered his art historical studies at the University of Exeter, UK, where he received a PhD in art history and visual culture. He is also the author of the book Brunelleschi's Basilica, the Building of Santa Spiritu in Florence. After living in Florence, I'm so jealous, for 20 years, Dr. Ruggiero now divides his time between the United States and Italy. In the US, he offers online art history courses, specialized lectures, educational webinars, and cultural events throughout the country as a paid speaker on Italian art and architectural history. In Italy, he offers private excursions and week-long travel programs throughout the country. Everyone, please join me in a warm Flint welcome for Dr. Ruggiero.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank all of you. A big buonasera to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to join me this evening. It's my first time to Flint, Michigan. I mentioned to Tracy earlier that I've flown through Detroit a billion times, but never actually stepped out of the airport. And today I had the pleasure of visiting the Detroit Institute of Arts and the collection here as well. So complimenti, as the Italians say. I was impressed and am impressed really by the amazing quantity of art in general, but specifically of great Italian art that you have here in the great state of Michigan. So, folks, tonight I have the pleasure of talking about one of the most iconic and famous works of art on the planet, and that, of course, is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. And Tracy mentioned that she loved the title. Remember that, in the end, technically what's happening in the actual scene is indeed a dinner party, a rather tragic one, but a dinner party nonetheless. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's just stop and kind of remind ourselves of who the creative mind was behind the production of the Last Supper. And of course, his name was Leonardo da Vinci. And just to give you some brief biographical information, Leonardo was born on April 15th of the year 1452. He died on May 2nd of the year 1519. And his artistic career, although he was from Vinci originally, actually began in the city of Florence. And if you've been fortunate enough to visit the Uffizi Gallery and stand behind or in front of this particular work, then you've seen what technically is considered to be his first ever professional work of art, or what technically we would qualify as a masterpiece, right? We use that term incorrectly today. Everything's a masterpiece if it's an important work or what have you, but technically a masterpiece is defined by that work of art produced by an artist that marked the moment of transition from apprentice status to master. In fact, the expression that we would use today, usually in the context of professional sports, would be to go pro. Right? Someone went pro right out of high school. Well, Leonardo went pro with the ripe old age of 20, which was a bit precocious. Most artists went master status when they were about 23 or 24, Leonardo jumping the gun. And by the way, I have this fantasy, this recurring fantasy, that one day I will walk into the Uffizi Gallery in Florence and find a surprise party waiting for me, a kind of roast where essentially all the people at the Uffizi will say, you've been doing this so long, proliferating the beauty and knowledge of our great collection, that we will allow you to take one of these paintings home with you. Right? And given my choice of any painting in the Uffizi Gallery, this is the one that I would have in the back of a pickup truck in 5 minutes flat and sitting in my living room soon thereafter as well. Now, 20 when he painted this, 29 years old when he began work on this unfinished painting, which depicts the Adoration of the Magi. Right? An unfinished work which was recently restored. In fact, it went back to the Uffizi in 2017, and for me was almost unrecognizable. It was so different from what it looked like before. But the question people ask all the time is, why did Leonardo leave this piece unfinished? Now, we're not going to feed the beast of geniuses essentially losing focus or somehow becoming bored with their projects and so abandoning them. Most of the time, artists left works of art unfinished because they were simply too in demand. You follow? The commissioning of more works of art would prevent them from completing one before they began work on another. And in fact, it was around this time in 1481, 1482, that Leonardo was having a bit of a professional crisis. Right? It seems like he'd fallen out of love with this freelance painter profession that he had chosen, because most of the pressure on you was for the entrepreneurial part of your job. You had to take multiple commissions, you had to wine and dine your clients, and it wasn't leaving Leonardo da Vinci enough time to do what he really wanted to do, which was scientific research. Folks, if Leonardo da Vinci handed you a business card in the 15th century, he would not qualify himself as an artist, but instead as a natural scientist. So Leonardo heard of a job opportunity. Up in the northern city of Milan, the regent, soon to become Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, was looking for a court artist. Now, as a court artist, it means you work for one guy, right? You get a fixed salary, so obviously your finances are a bit more secure. You may be asked to do things that would seem below your station, like costume design, like theater design, like events planning. Trace said she loved the title, but Leonardo da Vinci actually loved to be an events planner. He is recorded as planning so many of the spectacular dinners and events that took place at the Sforza court. So Leonardo realized that this was the opportunity, perhaps, to free himself up of this sort of freelance lifestyle, to dedicate himself to one patron, and to discover more free time for his scientific research. So Leonardo did what we all do when, in fact, we look for a new job, and that was to supply a resume. All right? Now, it is a pretty extraordinary thing to be able to see how someone like Leonardo da Vinci qualified himself for a place of employment. Right? This is a transcription of the original letter that he sent to the regent, Ludovico Sforza. And he begins his resume the way we all do when we're looking for a job, and that's by sucking up to your potential employer. Right? He actually calls him my most illustrious, il mio illustrissimo Signore. That's how he addresses the Duke. Said, having heard that you were looking for an artist to come in and to work for you, I here essentially itemize all of my qualifications. And you can see how orderly it is. Look, it's numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And every one of these little paragraphs actually describes Leonardo's prowess as a military engineer, not as an artist, not even as a scientist. He says he has ways to create very lightweight bridges that will be strong and easy to transport. He talks about ways he can create Palazzo da Agide. These are the siege engines that you see in medieval warfare, those giant towers that they bring up to the walls. He has a means by which to create modi di bombardare comodissime, very convenient ways of bombarding your enemies. I can come up with that as well. All of these to play to his employer's taste. He was a warmonger. Ludovico was constantly and belligerently bothering his neighbors, and so Leonardo thought he could find his way in. And all the way down here at the bottom is another very important line regarding his abilities, and he says that I am also able to realize the cavallo di bronzo, the bronze horse, because Leonardo knew that Ludovico was planning on creating a massive bronze equestrian monument in honor of his dad, whose name was Francesco, you see it right here, Sforza. That was the name of the family. So this was probably what actually got Leonardo the job. So when word got back, look, you've been accepted, he left that painting unfinished that I showed you a moment ago, packed his suitcases, hopped on the next high-speed train north to the city of Milan. And that horse project would linger over him for the entire 19 years that he spent in that particular city, but ultimately was never realized in Leonardo's lifetime. In fact, we'd have to wait 400 years, for the realization of the horse. The 70 tons of bronze, 70, that were in fact intended for the realization of this horse, were instead used for the production of cannons. It seems that Ludovico Sforza's militaristic tendencies got the better even of this particular monument. And so based on Leonardo's designs, based on what we know about what this thing was supposed to look like, the Japanese-American artist Nina Akamu, in fact, realized the horse finally in 1999. There's one in Milan, and I don't have a picture of it. There's another here in Michigan, by the way, right? Full-scale production of the horse, which up to the nose right there is 20 feet tall. And remember, it's missing its rider. Presumably, if we put a person on here, the entirety of it would stand 28 feet tall. Now, one thing is for certain, everyone, if Leonardo had realized this, if Leonardo had seen this particular project through, forget about the Mona Lisa, forget about the Last Supper. His defining work of art would have been this giant bronze horse. But he did not see it through, because again, the bronze was used for other purposes. But fortunately, there was another project in Milan that kept him busy. And that, of course, was the great mural known as the Last Supper. All right? Now, the work of art depicts this event that took place on Holy Thursday when Jesus Christ and 12, soon to be 11 of his best friends are sharing their last meal together. All right? Now, what I want you to realize is this. This particular subject, the Last Supper, occurs in almost two exclusive contexts in Italy. Right? And in fact, if you don't know, the Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci is not in a museum. Okay? It is actually still where it was painted some 500 years ago, and that is in the convent of the Dominican church in Milan called Santa Maria delle Grazie. All right? So this church, which is still an operative church, was in fact chosen by Ludovico Sforza as his sort of personal mausoleum. This is where he and his heirs, his wife, they would all be entombed. It would become this great kind of funerary complex. So the architect Bramante, Donato Bramante, who was the most important of all high Renaissance architects, redid the entire tribuna area, and then it was Leonardo's job to decorate the actual convent itself to make it appropriate for such a great ruler. Now, curious, how many of you have seen Leonardo's Last Supper in person? See a show of hands. Okay, for those of you who have not, word of warning, it's not easy. Right? To get a reservation today is pretty tricky. And when you get the reservation, you have to go to Milan. And let's be honest, there's really not much else to see in Milan. You know, it's not Florence, it's not Venice, it's not Rome. Most people who go there, I think, either go there for the fashion, go there, for the Last Supper itself. And then you have to be there a half an hour early to collect your ticket. Then you go through the security check. Then you go through a series of hermetically sealed climate and humidity controlled chambers before you actually get in. And you only have about 15 minutes when you're in there. And to be perfectly honest, by the time your head stops spinning, because you're sort of coming to grips with the fact that you're standing in front of one of the most extraordinary works of art of all time, the guards start yelling at you, "Finita la visita, tutti fuori." The visit is over, get the hell out, right? In a very kind of aggressive way. It happens so quickly that sometimes people say, did I really see the Last Supper? So you almost want to do it again. You might want to book 2 reservations if you're lucky enough. Well, to just give you a sense of what your experience is like when you're there, this is what the mural. Now notice I'm not calling it a fresco, and I'll explain why at the end of my presentation. The mural, that is the Last Supper, remember a mural simply means a painting on a wall, is located at the northern end of the refectory, of the dining hall. So I said that Last Suppers occur almost exclusively in 2 contexts, one of which is in the dining halls of monasteries and convents. Because the idea is Jesus and his buddies sharing a meal, the friars, the monks, the nuns sharing their meals also inside of the room proper. It is 15 feet tall, it is 29 feet across, so it's quite large, right? And what you don't really see well anymore is all of the heraldic imagery up here, which celebrates Ludovico Sforza and his wife's family that was named Este, and their shields and their coats of arms or what have you as well. Folks, consider that it's almost miraculous that this thing still exists in any form. In fact, not that long ago, I read, what is his name? Etzel, the Robert Etzel, Monuments Men. There was the other book that came out called Saving Italy, in which there's this really disturbing black and white photograph of just this single wall of this room standing after the refectory received a direct bomb hit in 1944. They had sandbagged it, fortunately, and covered it in scaffolding, and that was enough to actually preserve it. So this is what the Last Supper looks like today inside of the actual refectory proper, right? All right, another very important point, everyone. We use the definite article all the time, right? This is the Last Supper. But what I want you to realize is that in reality, this is a Last Supper. This is one of many interpretations and representations of this particular subject. So before we can talk about Leonardo and his personal interpretation, we need to go back and trace the evolution of the subject. And consider that the first ever Last Supper pictorial representation goes all the way back to the 6th century after Christ, some 1600 years ago, to one of my favorite places in Italy, which is the town of Ravenna on the Adriatic coast. Right? Ravenna is home to the world's most important collection of Byzantine mosaics. I didn't say Byzantine style, I said Byzantine. The mosaics in Ravenna date back to the 400s and to the 500s after Christ. You don't really find them anymore in Istanbul because the majority of them were destroyed when Constantinople became Istanbul. You find them here instead. And if you visit the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo, the church you're looking at right now, you'll, of course, realize that some of it has been redone. You can see that hideous Rococo apse there in the back. The ceiling was redone as well. But what is original is essentially the nave, the columns coming down, and the mosaic decoration up top. And in fact, way up here on the wall is the oldest known cyclical representation of the life of Jesus Christ in the Western world. Now, I know those of you who've been to Italy and been to the Uffizi and the Vatican museums, and after a while, you're sort of like, God, do they ever do anything that's not religious, right? And you just kind of imagine that that's what they always did. But interestingly, when we go back to the 6th century, those Christian stories are relegated to the very top part of the wall. And if you don't know to look for them, you're not going to look for them, you follow? And in fact, on this side, way up here above one of the windows, is that oldest representation of the Last Supper. Now consider that chronologically speaking, this is the closest to the actual event, if we were to believe that the event took place. That is, that Christ and those apostles shared that Passover meal. And look how Greco-Roman this representation is. No chairs, right? They're reclining the way the Greeks and the Romans did. They're wearing togas the way the Greeks and the Romans did. We can clearly make out the figure of Jesus Christ here with his halo and his royal purple robe. We can make out Peter with his characteristic white hair and beard. And we can make out the other important figure in a Last Supper, who of course was the protagonist, Jesus Christ, the antagonist, Judas Iscariot. If you don't know the story, he of course was the apostle who betrayed Jesus Christ and essentially caused him to be crucified. And you can see that he's Judas because he's sitting over here. He's smaller in scale. And look at the daggers shooting out of the eyes of all the other apostles. You hear him growling at him, right? Because he's sort of the bad guy in the particular scene. My favorite detail in this Last Supper, remember, this is Passover, so they should be eating lamb, but we're in Ravenna. We're right on the Adriatic coast. Seafood is, in fact, their specialty, so we substitute the lamb with spigola, with Mediterranean sea bass. It's healthier for you anyway, right? Look at the two big fish that you actually see there on the platter. So this idea of almost, again, personalizing the subject of the Last Supper. Now, for our next important Last Supper, we go to one of my favorite places in the world, and that is the great Tuscan city of Siena, where once upon a time, inside of Siena's great Gothic-style cathedral, there was a massive altarpiece known as the Maestà. Maestà is the Italian word for majesty. And this painting was once the largest ever altarpiece painted in Italian art. It has since been cut down, and pieces of it are located throughout the world, but this is the front side. Now consider that the front side of the painting is about as big as this image that I'm showing you. It's about 7 feet tall, it's about 14 feet across in its current state. Originally, it was closer to 16 by 17 feet. Right? This is what the front side of the painting looks like. This is what the back side of the painting looks like today. So the first context in which we see Last Suppers is refectories. The second context in which we see Last Suppers is in Passion cycles, because of course this is the event that happens on Holy Thursday. And in fact, if you look at this assembly of 26 scenes representing the Passion of Jesus Christ, you may note that the Last Supper is down here. All right? So we go right from the triumphal entry to the washing of the feet down to the Last Supper. Here it is, up close. All right? Now, you look at the image, you see Jesus, you see the apostles, and I told you that the two guys you're looking to spot are, of course, the protagonist and antagonist. And so I think we can immediately spot Jesus. All right? We all concur that this is Jesus. And the question is, well, how do we know that it's Jesus? Well, because he looks Jesus-y, all right? Now, I say that facetiously, but what that means is iconography. In other words, Jesus always looks the same. And one of the other lectures I love to give is my Saint Symbols and Spaghetti lecture, where essentially I parallel these medieval saints to modern DC and Marvel superheroes. Yeah, I mean, no one has any problem recognizing Spider-Man or differentiating him from Superman or Batman because they all have their identifying kind of characteristics. Same holds true for these medieval saints. Jesus looks like a combination of a hippie and an Ivy League professor, right? Somewhere in between. He's usually in the middle. He's doing the Jesus-y thing, right? He kind of looks like he's reaching out or what have you. Okay, he's easy enough to spot. But which one of the figures is Judas? Not so easy, is it? Now, what I want you to all realize is this, that when you look at any Last Supper, whether it's Leonardo's or anyone else's, there are a certain set of criteria that you can apply to identify Judas, right? And in fact, if we go to another Last Supper, this one located in the Franciscan convent of Santa Croce. This was their great refectory. Painted by Taddeo Gaddi. He was one of Giotto's important students. And you can actually see that the Last Supper is secondary. Right? What's more important is this scene of Jesus Christ up there on the cross, the so-called wood of life, the lignum vitae. And the Last Supper instead relegated to this kind of secondary role. Now, if we look at it, I think all of you can identify Judas rather quickly. Which one's Judas? Okay, now here are the three criteria. Here, all of you kind of giving one of the motifs. First and foremost, we can identify Judas by using what I call the isolation theory, because in most medieval Last Suppers, Judas sits all by his lonesome on one side of the table while everyone else is sitting on the other side. Isolation theory. I heard someone else saying he's the only one without a halo. So the halo theory, because you can probably well imagine Judas ain't no saint. So he's usually the only one in the room not wearing a halo. Do you wear a halo? Granted, whatever. He doesn't have a halo, okay? And then the third way by which we can identify Judas in any Last Supper is what I call the food and beverage theory. All three of the four Gospels concur that Judas identified himself either by dipping bread into a bowl of wine at the same time as Christ, or by taking a sop of bread in the Gospel of John before Christ did. So if you see one of the apostles dipping bread into a bowl of wine, you know that it's Judas. All three happen here. He's isolated, he's haloless, and look at that left hand dipping the bread into the bowl of wine. All right, now using those criteria, let's go back to Duccio and try to figure out which of these figures is Judas. Now, interesting that Duccio has placed 5 guys in front of the table. And the reason he does this, you can't know, but in the previous scene, the washing of the feet, the room is the same one you're looking at here. So in order to keep the room consistent throughout all the different images, he's forced to place 5 figures here. So we can't use the halo theory, can we? Because 5 figures are haloless. And why does Duccio keep all 5 of them haloless? Because in a pre-perspective world, everyone, if he put halos on 4 of the 5 heads, those halos would obstruct the table. And you probably wouldn't even recognize it as a Last Supper. So he's forced to depict them all haloless. We can't use the isolation theory because of the reason I just said. And can we use the food and beverage theory? Well, not really. This guy who's the smartest in the whole room, he's drinking wine. You see him right there? This guy has a piece of bread in his hand, and that guy has a piece of bread in his hand. So we throw all 3 traditional criteria out the window. So how can we figure out which one of these guys is Judas? Now, when I teach in Italy and I bring my undergraduates to Siena and we're sitting in the museum in front of the painting, and I play the same game that I play with you. Which one of these figures is Judas? And the only hint that I give them is to remind them not to lose sight of the forest because of the tree. They, of course, all look at me and say, what the hell does that mean? That means that inevitably you'll sit here, look at this painting, trying to find something in it that will reveal the identity of Judas, but it's not in this painting. The only way to figure out which one is Judas is to keep reading the story. So if we're down here at the Last Supper, we go to the next scene. You almost have to fast forward. And if you fast forward to right there, we have the Pact of Judas, where you see him dressed in the green robe, orange toga, brown hair and beard, taking the 30 silver pieces. You see that? And so now that we know what he looks like, we can go back, and reverse engineer this and realize that which one of these 5 figures is Judas? The one down here, second from the left. All right? Now, why is this one so complicated? The reason that I've always maintained is because this is an audience-specific Last Supper. In other words, the backside of this painting would only have been seen by clergy, priests, who may have actually enjoyed this little challenge. Instead of playing Where's Waldo, they played Where's Judas on the backside of Duccio's Maestà. Did Leonardo see this? I'm fairly certain that he did. Right? Another Last Supper that Leonardo would have been familiar with is in the great city of Padua. In fact, this is my absolute favorite work of art on planet Earth, the fresco cycle in the Scrovegni Chapel, where the great Giotto paints his Last Supper. And for years, I used to say, there's really nothing extraordinary about this. And then one of my undergraduates actually gave me a moment of pause and reflection and said, look, nobody in this Last Supper is looking at the camera. You know, a lot of times you look at these paintings and everyone's sort of, they're kind of pantomime. It looks so contrived. So I'm going to use a very technical word for all of you. It looks so cheesy sometimes, right? But Giotto, like a great movie director who has great actors, or who can turn them into great actors, has everyone going about their business, and none of them seem conscious of the fact that they're being depicted. And this is perhaps the greatest compliment that I can pay to any artist of this time. That instead of looking like something the artist created, it looks like something the artist captured, which is absurd because, of course, something called photography did not exist. But that's how spontaneous it looks. There's Jesus, and here's Judas. See him dipping the hand in? Right? And also smaller in scale and somewhat set apart from everyone else. Okay, but let's look at a Last Supper that's a little bit closer to Leonardo da Vinci. Right? And that is the one located in the now deconsecrated convent of Santa Apollonia in the city of Florence. All right, if any of you are going to Florence anytime soon, you go to the great Dominican convent San Marco with all of its beautiful frescoes by Fra Angelico. Well, right down the street, 200 feet down the street, you can see this and see it free of charge. It's one of the best kept secrets in Florence, one of the hidden treasures. You walk in, this thing's huge, comparable in size to Leonardo's. And you see the date, 1450. So this is 45 years before Leonardo da Vinci's painting. I guarantee you Leonardo da Vinci saw this one. So here are Jesus and the apostles sitting in this room, very decorative space that you see. But what happens here is that there are a whole bunch of sort of staggered actions that are happening. In other words, if we read this Last Supper from left to right, it looks like one of those, you know, those work dinners that none of us really want to go to, right? But you really don't have a choice, right? So let's start over here. We have St. James Minor and St. Philip. These guys are the guys who just, I mean, they're loving this, right? Those are the guys who want to be there, and they probably want to sit together intentionally so that they can keep talking about work, right? They're very much enthralled in what's going on. This is the guy thinking about the golf game the next morning. Like, I can't wait to get out there, play 18 holes. By the way, this is St. Thomas, right? Doubting Thomas. And so the idea is, you know, he's engaged in thought, right? Skeptical thought, of course. In other words, their gestures reflect their identities. Because remember, everyone, when these nuns or monks or friars are sitting in the refectory eating meals, it's dead silent. Or you hear one of the monks, friars, or sisters reading scripture. So the Last Supper is like a dinner and a show kind of thing, right? In other words, the artist also introducing kind of entertainment features as well. In fact, next to Thomas is St. James the Great. And why is he looking at that glass at about neck level? Well, because James's method of martyrdom was beheading. So that's an allusion to his future martyr. And the nuns in Santa Apollonia would have picked up on this. Let's look at the main group. All right. So here we have Judas, isolated, without a halo, and look, got a piece of bread in that right hand. Notice, by the way, this very interesting shape that comes out of Jesus' robe. Looks like a champagne flute. I think it's a happy coincidence, but other people think that it's meant to represent a chalice. Look at Peter, whose right arm comes up, but it's his left hand that's attached to it. Ooh, that's kind of weird and interesting, right? Here is John, the beloved apostle, who I have nicknamed John the Lush Apostle, because the Gospels concur he drank a little too much and boom, passed out. And you can almost hear Jesus thinking, I can't bring this kid anywhere, right? As he face down on the table right there as well. And look at the transformation of Judas. Based on the Gospel of John, the pointy beard, the hook nose, the pointy ears. The Gospel of John says the moment he decides to betray Jesus Christ, the devil takes hold of him. And we see this physical transformation actually taking place. Okay, let's keep going. And by the way, I'm not some sort of their names are written right underneath there, right? That kind of helps. St. Andrew, who needs a cheat sheet, right? St. Andrew, look at that big knife, and look at the look of concern on the face of St. Bartholomew. Why is he so scared? Because Bartholomew would be later skinned or flayed alive. So there's kind of an inside joke, right? The nuns would giggle because Bartholomew looks like he suffers from a clinical condition known as echmophobia, fear of knives or sharp objects, right? So again, for a clerical audience, one that would be appreciated, this is my favorite. Matthew's that guy you just don't want to sit next to, right? Because he's the one who just won't stop working. And look at the despondent face on Simon saying, oh, man, how do I get out of this, right? As we look, but every one of these groupings or actions is sort of isolated from the others, right? There are a bunch of different actions occurring in the same space. And that's typical of 15th century art, of the period that we call the early Renaissance. And that's what's so extraordinary about this one, right? First and foremost, Leonardo sets the Last Supper in one of the most perfect expressions of linear perspective in the history of art. These massive rectangular forms are tapestries hanging on the wall. You can even see the nails that fix them there. And if you were to draw a line across the top of them, you'd realize that the vanishing point in this painting is just to the left of Jesus Christ's head. You notice that none of the figures in this painting have halos. And why does Leonardo do away with the halo? Because it's absurd. I mean, do you wear a halo? Does it fall on your head? I mean, does it come out of your ears? In other words, if Leonardo was trying to achieve naturalism, he realizes that by putting discs of light on people's heads, it would defeat the entire purpose. But the interesting thing, I know it's almost impossible to see, but there's this rounded pediment above the window here. All right, again, if just bear with me, if you could see it, what you'd realize is that if you were to continue it into a full circle, it backs Jesus' head like a halo would, and it's the natural light coming through the window that serves as that sort of halo. All right, so a suggested one as opposed to a contrived and obvious one instead. But I think what makes this even more important, everyone, is the fact that Leonardo distills the narrative of the Last Supper down to a single moment. And it is the moment when Jesus Christ drops the proverbial bomb on the apostles by announcing to them, this night, one of you will betray me. You follow? It's that single action, that single moment that Leonardo, again, instead of seemingly creating the scene, looks like he was the photographer in the room, lying on the floor somewhere with his camera. And like all great photographers, his spider sense started to tingle, picks up the camera, and then boom, he grabs that moment just as it happens. And it ends up on the cover of Life magazine, if you get my drift. It's one of these iconic moments, almost as if most people think that this is how the Last Supper actually took place. Well, because that's how Leonardo represented it, you follow? And so the idea that you have Jesus in the center having made the announcement, and waves almost of energy and emotion going all the way out and then coming all the way back in. So if we start with the group of three, in fact, let me go back for one sec. Notice how he's broken up the 12 apostles into 4 groups of 3, but each group tied into the one adjacent to them. So let's start over here. We're going to go left to right like we did before. We have Saint Bartholomew. Now, this is that, you see this all the time in drama, theater, movies, right? He leaps to his feet, and you can almost imagine the chair kicking out from behind him. Right? Obviously, something dramatic has just taken place. And his concern might also be caused by the fact that the knife in the hand of Peter, you don't see him yet, but inadvertently points in his direction. So is he concerned that someone's going to betray Jesus Christ, or is he yelling, Peter, put that knife down, right? As he sees it there. Here is St. James the Minor, which means the younger of the 2 St. James. Here is St. Andrew. And these gestures, one of my favorite stories about the Last Supper is that the now late Nobel Prize winner, Dario Fo, the Italian actor, theater historian, would take his students from the University of Milan to see the Last Supper to teach them gesticulation, right? How to use Leonardo's gestures as universal gestures for certain emotions. Now, here is one of the main groups. We have Judas sitting on the same side as everyone else. That's a big innovation, everyone. And I think Leonardo also realizing that it seems a bit silly to have 12 guys on one side and one all by himself on the other. So he puts, even though technically it seems foolish to have 13 guys on one side of the table as well. But here he is, lower than everyone else, darker skin, hooked nose, pointy beard, his left hand, his sinistra, his sinister hand, reaching for the piece of bread. And if all that's not enough to help you identify Judas, how about the money bag in his right hand? You see it right there? He's literally holding it. Now, one thing you can't see because of the deterioration is, in fact, the upturned salt cellar. The salt cellar has fallen down. You know that, of course, that means bad luck. It's a terrible omen, technically speaking. Okay? Now, next to him is Peter, who, according to the Gospel of John, leans over and asks John, hey, you're really tight with Jesus. Ask him which one of us is going to be the traitor. This figure that you see here, despite what you might have read in popular works of fiction, is not Mary Magdalene. That is Saint John, the beloved apostle, who was the youngest of the apostles. And convention in Renaissance art was to make men look young. They were made to look effeminate. You follow? I just literally on Monday gave a lecture about the life of Pope Pius II. And in the scenes that represent his early life, he has long blonde hair. He looks like a female because that was the convention of the time. You cut your hair usually when you got married or when you entered into manhood. So this is John the Beloved. Right? Now we have Christ isolated in the center and this other group of three. That's St. James the Great. I love that, whoa, pushing back with his arms, oblivious to the fact that there are people around him. Who's the guy pointing up with his right hand? Thomas. That's that finger that will probe the wounds of Jesus Christ later on. And I love the St. Philip thing with the hand, me, is it me, is it me, pounding his chest. And look at that look of turmoil upon his face. And this group of three is clearly connected to the next group of three by this right arm. I mean, it's extraordinary how Leonardo is able to sync all of it into one particular moment. So here's St. Matthew, whose arms point in one direction, but his head in the other. Right? That contrapposto. So then we have the figure of Thaddeus. Right? It's almost like, hey, did you hear what he said? He said, yeah, did you hear what he said? And then here's Simon saying, yes, I heard what he said. And those hands bring us back in the direction of the center of the actual painting. Now, what I want you all to realize is that as innovative as it is, this study, this drawing that Leonardo did in preparation for the Last Supper, actually shows us that originally he was planning on putting Judas on the other side of the table. You see him here? And how do we know who all the guys are in the Last Supper? Well, because he also labeled them. But of course, in his typical backwards script, right? Leonardo wrote things backwards, most likely because he was left-handed. And the interesting thing, you count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. What are these four guys doing down here? The paper wasn't big enough to put them over there. So look at the marker. You see that left arm? Okay, look at the left arm. That's how Leonardo said, okay, I finished there and I'll pick up there. So these four guys are supposed to go down there, technically speaking. I mean, just the thought process that was employed at the time. But clearly Leonardo then abandoning this notion of putting Judas on the other side, realizing, of course, that it just doesn't make sense in the real world, and then instead, more convincingly, putting him on the same side instead. Bringing it down to that single moment. And this really marks the beginning of the period that we call the High Renaissance, right? People always say that it was Leonardo's Last Supper that kind of ushered in this next stage of the Renaissance, where artists were no longer struggling to overcome the technical limitations of linear perspective, of naturalism, of movement, but now that form and content have kind of come together into this single moment. And it's interesting because it really, I mean, if you were to go home tonight and Google top 10 most famous works of art, this shows up in every single, sometimes it's number one, believe it or not. And in fact, I love when people show up to Florence and they kind of whisper, where's the Last Supper? Right? Say, oh, it's all the way up in Milan. But the amazing thing about it is that it was so celebrated even in its day that a multitude of copies, prints, engravings, drawings were made of it. And I remember growing up as an Italian in Rhode Island, and every household I went into, relatives, friends, most of which were Italian as well, you'd see a reproduction of Leonardo's Last Supper. But then I started to realize that more often than not, what I was looking at was not Leonardo's Last Supper, but a reproduction of Leonardo's Last Supper. And this is the one you see very often. This is a full-scale reproduction by a guy named Gian Pietrino, who was one of Leonardo's followers. And fortunately for us, he made this copy, because without it, we wouldn't be able to see much of what Leonardo painted. Like, for instance, You see the salt cellar right there that I mentioned before? Or Jesus' feet. Look, they're not there because the kitchen was behind this wall. And the friars got tired of having to leave the room, walk all the way around. So why not just knock a hole right through the wall to facilitate the transportation of food and what have you as well. Let me go back. Look at the tapestries and the colors that you see as well. Look at the windows that allow light to come through, the landscape in the background, the tiles on the floor, the food that they were eating. All of it comes to life when you look at one of the many copies of Leonardo's Last Supper. Because perhaps the most tragic thing about this painting, which I defined as a mural at the very beginning, I told you that it's a mural, not a fresco, is that fresco painting was not conducive to Leonardo's method of painting. Now, you always hear that you have to paint quickly in fresco, which is kind of hyperbole. You have to paint fast enough to complete what you're doing before the plaster dries, okay? But remember, the painters had all sorts of tricks to keep that plaster moist, like putting a wet towel against it, right? And if it did dry before you finished, you just hammer it off the wall and put another piece of plaster. It's not terribly expensive. But the process was just completely opposite the way Leonardo did things. Consider that Leonardo's nickname was the artist who never knew when to take his hand off of the canvas. He never knew when to stop. And personally, the reason I think he never knew when to stop was because when he stopped, the work of art died, right? As long as he kept working on it, it was a living organism. There was a biology to it, as long as it continued to grow and evolve and everything else. So that was just counterintuitive to Leonardo. So what he did for the Last Supper, instead of applying individual pieces of wet plaster and painting, he laid out the entire 15 by 29 foot section of wall. He then put 2 layers of gesso over it, then painted an undercoat of white paint, and then suspended his pigments in things like oil and glue and painted onto the dry surface, employing what we call not the a secco technique, but the not the a fresco technique, but the a secco, to the dry wall, not the fresh wall, technically speaking. So that the immediate effect was tremendous. This painting must have been incredibly bright, probably as detailed as what you're looking at right here, okay? But within decades of its execution, it began to decompose. Consider that one visitor to the Last Supper in the 1540s, 45 years after he painted it, described it as a spot on the wall. Said barely recognizable at all. And then a whole series of just atrocious and tragic restorations went on century after century. The most recent, although generally considered positive restoration, which began in 1978 and was completed 21 years later in 1999, right? Bringing the painting back to probably the closest we will ever get to what it looked like in Leonardo's day. But then the ethical debate began, and that is how much of the painting you're looking at today is by Leonardo da Vinci and how much of it is by the hand of the restorer. They estimate that about 30% of what you're looking at was actually painted by Leonardo. The rest through intervention of one form or another. Tragic, but if nothing else, the only way it's almost like putting it on life support, if you get my drift, right? And in fact, recently, a brand new HVAC system was put in as well to maintain the environment, the temperature, and what have you. And scientists estimate that they've added another 500 years on to the life of this particular painting simply by doing that. So all that hassle that I mentioned at the beginning, the making the reservation, the going through the loops and hurdles and what have you, and then ultimately is worth it to preserve one of the greatest works of art in the history of our species. All right, folks, thank you very much. I know we want to leave some time for questions, so feel free.